And perhaps the message of Judges is that God, the Lord of hosts, is with his people, even in the darkest hour, and even though they've got themselves into an awful mess, entirely without anyone else's help, they've managed it beautifully themselves. And if you're someone who sometimes messes up, it's reassuring to have the book of Judges. I suppose we all remember Judges from Sunday school. The stories are a gift to a Sunday school teacher. You might have to miss out some of the gory bits occasionally, giving instruction to young people about how to place a tent peg just at the right point in Sisera's head is perhaps not the thing you should encourage too much. Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, splendid stories, and images that stick with us. How many Christians use the phrase about putting out a fleece without necessarily taking a good hard look at the theology involved? The lights in the jars in Gideon's army, Samson's hair and Delilah's pleading, all these things are part of our heritage. I can even remember when Tate and Lyle golden syrup used to have a badge on it of a lion's carcass. Out of the strong came forth sweetness. Now, I bet you wouldn't use that as an advertising ploy today, because the odds are the manufacturer and the head of advertising wouldn't know the story either, so let alone the general public. But if that sort of thing was all that Judges was there to give us, then we wouldn't really be spending a few weeks on it, would we? And then the other thing about Judges is that bit at the end, chapters 17 to 21, a succession of squalid little tales, really thoroughly nasty, because the Bible tells things as they are. And at the end it points out that this is what happened in those days. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And some of them had a pretty weird idea of what was right. They give a picture of the worst of times. A picture of a nation descending into moral failure, debased convictions, and social disintegration. And then the other thing about the book of Judges that I find a little bit puzzling, you read through Joshua, everything's triumphant. You come into Judges, everything falls apart. And yet there's an overlap in the actual time period they cover. Well, of course, it's all about the conquest of the land. And as our next slide will show, there are two sides to conquest. There's the question of winning battles, destroying cities, seizing control, driving out inhabitants. That's the story of Joshua. Victories are won. The Lord gives them the victory against foes far stronger than themselves. But you may seize a city, and behind your back, the folk who used to live there come back and rebuild it. So as you read chapter 1 of Judges, you find verse 8, Jerusalem is sacked. But further down the chapter, the Jebusites are back. And they're there for the next few hundred years. And Judges tells you the other side, because to conquer a land and impose your people upon those that are there is a very different thing from changing the society that you've displanted. 1066 and all that. The Normans conquered England. But it took quite a long time for the old order, in fact, it never was completely removed. New bosses are in, but the staff are still the same. New ways are imposed, but the old ways to continue beside them. And so it was here. And Judges gives you the other side, the less triumphant side that accompanies any conquest. But it isn't just that. Something has gone drastically wrong at the beginning. And from what has gone wrong, a whole sequence of consequences follow. And what has gone wrong, what is at the root of the problem, is a broken covenant. And chapter 2 begins with that, and from it everything else flows. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give to your forefathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And he hadn't. He had given them victory. He had been with their armies. He had fought for them. He had kept his promise. But they did not keep their commitment to him. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars, yet you have disobeyed me. Instead of wholeheartedly rejecting any accommodation with the society they had conquered, any accommodation with something that was utterly corrupt, they had made a compromise. They'd made an accommodation. They'd come to an arrangement whereby both sides might live quietly together. One of the series, The Bible Speaks Today, The Message of Judges by Michael Wilcock, is, like anything Michael Wilcock has written, very readable and puts things very appropriately. The nub of the matter is the command to make no covenant with the inhabitants. It is of disobedience at that point that Israel stands accused. An imaginary dialogue may show us the reason. God asks, why have my plans for occupation not been carried through? Israel replies, we lack the military capability for the final push. And God responds, but did not I say to you that your willingness was wedded to my power? I would see to the expelling of the enemy. Something has gone wrong with that wedding of your willingness to my power. If you have not driven them out, then what have you done with them? And Israel has to answer, we have had to come to an arrangement. The terms have been as favourable as we could make them. They have not broken down the old structures. They have not expelled those who worship the Baalim. They have come to an arrangement, and they hope that God will still be with them. But God had sworn to give them the whole of this land. But he had also sworn that he would not give it wholly to a disobedient people. And so at the start, there's that broken covenant, and everything comes from that. The Israelites are doomed to have an internal weakness, a fifth column, a constant source of temptation. The nature religion, the fertility cults that were associated with heathen worship will always be there, with a pull to draw them away from God. God will not drive them out because they would not uncompromisingly reject them. And so there is ongoing weakness, and along with it there is fruitless remorse, and they weep. Paul talks about a godly sorrow which is good, leads to change, leads to restoration, leads to fruitfulness. And he also talks of a worldly sorrow that brings death. Mere remorse, regret that they've got into this mess, regret at the consequences, but no change of heart and mind. And this is the situation of the people and the reason for the scale of events right through this book of Judges. A broken covenant is followed by the decline of the people. The first sign of that decline I've described as memory loss. And just to demonstrate that I also suffer from it, I've put down 2 verse 6 and it should be 2 verse 7. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and who'd seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. But once they had died, the memory of what they had seen, even though they will have passed it on, because history was transmitted orally, by speech. You taught your children what had happened. Somehow that broke down, and the memory of God's goodness, the memory of God's power was lost when those who'd actually seen it were no longer there. They say that there will be another banking crisis when the people who lived through the last one are no longer working in banks, because they'll have forgotten. And they'd have thought, we'll find a new way of avoiding the consequences that happened last time. It can't happen to us. And an awful lot of sides of human life are like that. When people forget the last time things went wrong, then you can be quite sure they're about to go wrong again. And this is what happens here. There was a loss of memory. The great acts of God may have been formally remembered in the institutions of the feasts and so on. But for all practical purposes, they'd forgotten it. Memory loss. Treason. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord. They followed and worshipped various gods of the people around them. They forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. The gods that were worshipped by the Canaanites of various nationalities, it was a society that was Canaanite, they were concerned particularly with fertility, good harvests. It was an agricultural society. They believed in Baal, who was the god of the storm, but also of the productive rain. He was a god of nature, a god that they looked to bring them good harvests. And to encourage him, they had fertility cults. And things like ritual prostitution grew up in the temples. It appealed to the people because they could indulge their lusts, but at the same time give them a sort of spiritual coating. It was the way of the world all around Israel, and they succumbed to it. It was what others did. Yes, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob was a very different God from that. But there was an appeal about the faith of the people that they should have displaced and expelled, but had allowed to remain among them. And they succumbed to that appeal. And going along with it, doubtless alongside the feasts of Jehovah, doubtless they didn't abandon those, they just added something to them that made them valueless. But in God's eyes, it was treason. They had dumped him and taken up other gods, because his terms of engagement were quite simple. You either have me, or you have nothing. You either worship me alone, or you don't worship me at all. And I'm not bargaining on this. I'm not going to treat with you on it. Take it or leave it. God and God alone, and no other way. And so, as the enemy within lured them away from the worship of God, and as they went on in this way, so they found that God's pledge to defend them no longer applied. They had abandoned him, he would abandon them. Instead of being a shield around them to keep away the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Midianites, he would be with their enemies. And he would fight for them. His hand would be with their foes. And so, verses 14 and 15, they were no longer able to resist. The hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. Because, you see, when he brought the covenant to Israel, he made it perfectly clear that there were penalty clauses in the covenant. If you are unfaithful, I will fight against you. If you do not live by my laws in this land, you will lose the land. And they came true, because God always keeps his word, whether his keeping it is welcome or unwelcome. And of course, when this happened, they were desperately unhappy. They cried out to God. And yes, that was part of the covenant as well. I will put my name among you, and when you come and pray towards the place where I have placed my name, I will hear and I will deliver. And God did deliver. And he raised up judges, leaders, saviors, and delivered them. And while the judge lived, verse 18, they towed the line, and they enjoyed a measure of prosperity and safety. But when the judge died, oh dear me, memory loss again. They've forgotten the lesson, and it has to be repeated. It sounds almost as though it's going round in circles, but it isn't. It's much more sinister than that. It's spiralling down and down and down and down. And each time it gets worse. Each time they give up more quickly. Each time the deliverance is more temporary. And in fact, when you come to the outcome of the process, you discover that the final judge, the final deliverer, our friend Samson, never actually brings about any deliverance at all. The Philistines are still there with an iron grip on Israelite society. Samson can do the most fantastic things, but he doesn't actually deliver his people at any point. And the Philistines are still there with a stranglehold through Samuel's days and Saul's days, and it's only when David comes that a substantial and lasting victory is won. The process is downwards all the time. all the time, all the time. And the summary at the end of the passage we read was that the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons, and served their gods. And so we'll see a cycle of judges, rescue, then disintegration, panic, and God intervenes and brings them release again. But each time we're descending a little bit further. So at the end of the book, it's not surprising that you have these squalid little stories, cautionary tales, ways of showing us just how far the people of God could descend and how far their society could disintegrate. So it's a pretty dark tale, really. But there is light in the darkness. Was the problem the system of having judges? People who rose up in an emergency? Was it really that they were not actually very good at governing the country in between emergencies? Winston Churchill was probably the greatest of wartime leaders this country has had in the recent past, and possibly one of the least effective peacetime prime ministers, because there are people who are great for emergencies but not too good at maintaining things. Was that the problem? No, it wasn't the system. It was the people. There's a man called Samuel who was judge of Israel at Mizpah, 1 Samuel tells us. He was a judge. He was the next one in the sequence after the book of Judges. And he did great things for God. And he was a man of caliber. So no, it's not the system. The system can be there, and there can be a Samuel who's operating within the system of judgeship. Yes, he's a priest and a prophet as well, but he's a man of God. That's the difference. Then you have that little book in between Judges and 1 Samuel, the book of Ruth. And it begins with the phrase, "In the days when the judges ruled." So not everything was lousy in the times of the judges. There were people like Ruth, people like Boaz. But actually, when you look at the book of Ruth, the happy outcome is not merely because certain people acted honourably. It's because God had established a system within which honourable actions would bring good results. It was what God had given Israel in his laws to make provision for people like Ruth when they were operated by people like Boaz. So the real light in the darkness isn't Samuel or Ruth, but God, who keeps his word, who keeps his promise, who keeps his covenant, who is utterly faithful to his covenant, even when his people repeatedly and fragrantly refuse to keep theirs. And because he keeps his covenant, therefore his people are not wiped out, because he's promised that he would keep them. He's promised that he will be their God. They will be his people. He will discipline them. He will enforce the penalty clauses, but he'll go on being their God to the end of time and for eternity, because he's pledged his word. Sometimes it won't be very comfortable for them, but he'll be faithful. So that at the end of the day, what we see from the book of Judges is not only some fascinating stories and some little bits of our heritage that are still there, but we see the underlying bass note accompanying the discordant melody of the Israelites, the note of the faithfulness of God, who ever will be trustworthy, who will keep his word. Therefore, you, my people, are not consumed. And in a way, if we should, as our memories fade, forget some of the minor judges or even the major ones, forget some of the stories and just how many people Gideon had with him, if we remember that human unfaithfulness cannot destroy or thwart the faithful purpose of God, then I believe we will have got the message that this book is there to give us.